Next up is a topic. It's not sometimes the easiest to get across, but it absolutely has a huge impact across business messaging. Because you can have fantastic solutions, you can have the commercial model just right, you can have amazing team members, but if the regulation is, computer says no, you can't do anything, you can't get anywhere. Regulation is so important, and many of us in the world of business messaging know that. We know how different it is across the world, and joining me right now is Simeon Coney, who is the Chief Strategy Officer with AdaptiveMobile. So, Simeon, great to see you. I missed that. Can you just speak again? Because we missed that.
Yeah, am I coming through loud and clear now?
You are now. So sorry not to have you join us, but no, you're coming through loud and clear. You are the Chief Strategy Officer with AdaptiveMobile Security, now ANEA, AdaptiveMobile Security. Just explain who you are, your background, what Adaptive do, and the background behind choosing these topics. So when I was talking to you about what you wanted from the session, and this topic came up, and what prompted you to move into that direction?
Thanks, James. Yeah, so, well, been working in telco for well over 30 years now. I remember having to find the maintenance menu to send those original SMS messages, which unfortunately shows my age, I think. And yes, at AdaptiveMobile Security for 18 years now, we've really been focused on delivering protection and control solutions for the market. What we've really focused on is how can we make the whole experience of being digitally connected on your mobile device safe and secure. And that really spans a broad spectrum of things. You know, it's against unwanted communication, it's about enable people to express preferences, and it's also about finding behaviors and engagements that would be damaging to end users. Sometimes those can be very well intentioned, sometimes they can be absolutely outright malicious. So we see such a broad range of engagement. I mean, today we're protecting almost a quarter of the world's population. So we see a very broad spectrum of events. And one of the things I really wanted to talk about today was what we're seeing in terms of regulatory and industry awareness on best practices, because there has certainly been changes over the last few years, and I think we can certainly agree that when regulation meets industry, there is always a lag on time there, and there's always a gap of knowledge and experience. So really what we wanted to do today was to talk more about what we're seeing and possibly some areas where we can look to improve information, improve best practice, improve operations to help everyone.
Simeon, before we roll into your presentation and we start talking actually about the regulatory side of things, let's just talk about the threats in the marketplace in relation to A2P, what's been going on the past couple of years. So from talking to so many MEF members, it's become clear that there's been an increase in the number of threats, clearly using COVID as a veil, and that indeed was a principal driver for us to set up the SMS sender ID registry that Pat Flynn earlier was alluding to in Ireland, because the health authorities from the government there came to us and said, we like what you're doing in the UK, we think that should be brought to Ireland, and we were unable to initiate that and move with that. Have those threat numbers, the numbers you are seeing coming through and being blocked by your solutions deployed globally, have they decreased lately, or are they still as much or still as frequent as they have been in the past year or two? What's going on out there in the world? Because you're a global company.
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, in terms of threats, I think let's put them in terms of two buckets. I mean, there are the security threats, and those are continually issue-based. So one day there'll be a tsunami of threats, the next day may be quieter, the day after maybe just as severe as the previous day, even higher. Any crisis, any exploit, any newsworthy item, any system weakness will be used by attackers. So, never let a good crisis go to waste is their motto there. I think, though, the other aspect of threat to the A2P industry is consumer fatigue, consumers not embracing and adopting. And sometimes that's not just malicious. It can be misintentioned information. It can be over-communication, overly aggressive, inappropriate, and a whole range of behaviors that are just not what the consumer really wants to receive. And I think that's an interesting area as well that we're starting to get to see more industry focus on. It's not just the things that we would traditionally consider to be bad.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. So, the first thing is, and building on your previous point there, James, yes, things are continuing to increase. The volume of items that we are inspecting, the number of rules that we're needing to help people comply to, the number of things that people are concerned about in their business continually increases. Whether or not the attacks or the abuses themselves increase, the volume of things that people are interested in is absolutely increasing every month. And this is just an example of some of the areas. The key thing is this is not restricted to any one geography. We're seeing initiatives right across the globe here in all corners of the world where regulators are responding to customers, they're responding to the market changes, and also the industries themselves are starting to establish best practices. There's this inevitable cycle that as traffic grows, it will get more attention by regulators. As more traffic is sent, inevitably customers will receive communication they didn't want to, and they will complain, which in itself will generate attention by regulators. So it's somewhat of an inevitable cycle. The other factor, of course, is that increasingly the mobile industry is just one of many interconnected industries. James, you mentioned the financial industry there. We see them so reliant on mobile communication for their business that their regulation starts to impose on mobile regulation. So it's certainly what we're finding is this evolution from just looking from traditional bad traffic to an evolution towards really helping consumers across a broad range of industries and helping them all the time. This is not just the responsibility of traffic that one person may send. This is responsibility for that customer's entire daily life on that device. We need to help them ensure that they are helped all of the time. And I think, firstly, the biggest challenge for regulators is how are they able to get appropriate and timely information to make the right decisions? As an industry, we are sitting there absorbing information and traffic on an absolute minute-by-minute basis. The regulators are typically responding after the fact to data points that come to them, whether it be from end user complaints, whether it be on feedback mechanisms, whether it be on other industries. And the comment was made yesterday about there is a difference between having a knowledge of the market versus being an active participant in that, which very much comes down to the speed of response. And regulation will always lag the market and the issues faced there.
Simeon, if I could just come in here, what about consistency? Because when we talk about SMS, and we know how much SMS plays a role in the world of business messaging, it's still very dominant as a channel globally, there's this inconsistency across the industry where you hear certain parties saying SMS should never be used for two-factor authentication. It's bad. It should never be used. But then, if someone doesn't have a smartphone, a consumer, who needs to be authenticated, if they don't have access to Wi-Fi or mobile broadband, how's that going to be achieved without SMS? So what about the importance of the industry speaking consistently with a voice and who from the industry should be I suppose, the spokesperson for that? Is that the role of organisations, member-led organisations like MEF, or from your perspective, who should it be?
Yeah, so it's a perfect point, I think, there on when people make statements or when industry organisations make statements, and by industry I don't mean necessarily the telco industry, there is generally a starting point. There's a reason, a catalyst, a cause for making that, or if you like, that started off an initiative. So yes, when we see people say SMS, is it wholly secure for sending two-factor authentication messages? Great example. Statements made though on solutions are, as you've just pointed out, so often in absence of the actual operational practical realities that is said at every single one of these conferences by at least 5 or 6 or 7 people. You know, it's ubiquitous, it just works for all users. Yes, there are some brilliant technology solutions out there that work for a minority of users. And so I think that comes down to having data available. When people are making pronouncements or recommendations, I think as an industry, we are in the best position, I mean, you know, us, the MEF community, amongst others, to be able to say, okay, great, how does that apply in all of these scenarios, in all of these situations? How does that reach people in these countries? How does it reach people who don't have smartphones? How does it reach people who may not have a permanent data connection, who may not have biometrics embedded in their latest devices? So I think having that data set and say, is this a solution intended for a subset, or is this something that needs to apply for everyone, will help level and actually enrich people's engagement with our industry to consider these broader and more important perspectives rather than just taking a technology solution.
I think it's something as well that all of us, I'm sure, in the room have been seeing, particularly if you're from the UK and countries close to here, is that SMS fraud and instances of it are now starting to be reported regularly in the mainstream media. And I think back a few years, 5 years, definitely 10 years, that was never the case. So there's definitely more acknowledgement, or let's certainly say more information coming into the public domain about the issue. But like you said, we've got to get a handle on the facts and the statistic and make sure those come out.
Yeah,
okay.
I think in terms of the mainstream media coverage, that is the simplest and clearest evidence that these problems are getting worse.
Yeah.
You know, media is financially orientated more than probably many other industries. You know, if people aren't interested in it, it doesn't get printed on a front page and they don't sell copies. The fact that there is so much attention being paid to it shows that it is something that affects more and more people in their daily lives.
Yeah, and I think you're right there as well. That fraud, for example, like grey routes that are being used and quite often used to push fraudulent messages, grey route usage has increased. It is increasing. So that was actually the keynote from Omdia at last year's business messaging event in March, I remember. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think perhaps where regulation often fails is it's about making pronouncements of behaviour, not always trying to seek to understand why something occurs. You know, why are grey routes existing? Is it because of lack of capacity? Is it because of consistency of delivery or speed of engagement, or the carrier's own abilities to provide appropriate connectivity? You know, understanding those sort of factors and really where the regulator can help rather than just recommend strict rules of adherence, I feel is another area that is often missed.
Thanks.
And in fact, I mean, on that point, I think, you know, this is my simplest slide. You know, we see such a spectrum of regulation. I mean, we talk about consistency of experience. There is such an inconsistency in regulation as well. We see light touch regulation that's really designed to facilitate. And again, we heard yesterday of examples of countries where the regulator is actually trying to facilitate an effective ecosystem. And then we see other cases where there is highly prescriptive, highly defined regulation that actually in some instances can cause far more problems as a result of being well-intentioned but poorly executed. And I think, that is the sharing of knowledge. And again, I know there's some great consultancies out there who talk with regulators. I think there's an opportunity as an industry body to maybe amplify the experience gained in regulation and the data to support that, to help that engagement with regulators, to help them learn. Because so often regulators have a parochial view only within their country, only within their sphere of operation. Whereas we as an industry have it for the whole globe. We have the opportunity to help educate them. So on the point of poor regulation, there are so many evidences of highly prescriptive regulation, tightly defined rules that just don't work. In this, I was just trying to find one clear example. And one is any time that something is absolutely prescriptively defined, what it does is, in essence, gives a very clear boundary to work around. The simplest example of this is a defined sending limit per sender. We've seen this in so many countries where they say, right, this is a limit. That limit is either an absolute limit per sender, or maybe it's a definition limit. Anybody who does more than that limit is considered a business. Anybody who does less is considered a consumer. These are always a bad idea.
So you're talking about fair usage policies within mobile operators?
Fair usage policies from the perspective of enforcing limits rather than fair usage from a consumer price packaging perspective. Because yes, there's certainly a need to avoid people abusing a connection and saying, hey, I'm now going to vote 10,000 times on my favorite reality TV show, using this connection. That may happen, but that's certainly the minority. I think more it's about folks who say, oh, hey, I can send up to 100 messages per sending party identity, and everything under that is considered consumer and available at a particular price point, for example. And the chart I've just put here is what we find in so many networks. Without knowing anything about the regulation or the rules, we can always spot what those thresholds are, or what fraud detection thresholds are by observing the behavior. So this is just a simple chart of the number of messages sent per unique sender in one gang with a volumetric threshold. So the vertical axis is how many messages per day. And what you can see is that there are a huge number of users or members in this gang, all of whom are sending just under 100 messages per day. Programmatically, it's an algorithm that just says, hey, there's clearly detection thresholds and regulation in this particular environment that says anything over 100 per day is bad. Well, I'll just add another 5 or 10 or 50 or 100 members to that group, brings my traffic below that magic 100 threshold, and I'm never detected. I am perfectly operating within the boundaries and within the rules of that regulation. So, things like that become an arbitrary value. And so really, there are so many examples where a well-intentioned rule, or there is a need at least to put a pin in a map to say, okay, this is a value, but it becomes an empirical point that an industry builds and responds to. And that creates inefficiencies, and it creates the opposite effect of the intent of regulation.
But Simeon, what can providers do? So the days, I think, of mobile operators saying, unlimited truly means unlimited. People can send unlimited SMS, unlimited minutes voice calls, unlimited data, etc., etc. Certainly when it comes to SMS, their limitations are coming in. You will see in the agreements from many operators, fair usage policy applies, and many I've seen, that limit is 5,000 a month, which is for SMS, which is still high, which is high. What's the other option if you don't have that? What could you have? Or it's just, we've got to have this certain limit and we've got to understand this and be looking for this pattern with just random parametric routing. This is what you're looking at really here, is, for example, a SIM farm being used, so box with multiple SIM cards in. People know that the mobile operator is looking for usage of 100 messages a day or more. Let's just set it randomly with my software, one doing 89, the other one doing 98, 99, etc. What's the other option? Is there another option or not?
Well, there are other options. And in fact, I mean, we're increasingly seeing the regulation forcing the adoption of those other options. I think the reason for limits is because counting is easy. You know, counting is really straightforward to do. I can see how many X has somebody done. You know, I count in my billing system, I count in various other systems. And actually the other aspect is it's really easy to articulate to end users. You know, you have X amount to do. So it is a simple thing. It is a fair and understandable starting point. But, you know, what we're starting to see now with regulation is it going more towards, well, what actually is being conducted over that? You know, I don't really care how many it is what you're doing with it. So that's the type of regulation that is forcing, I think, the industry to start saying, well, actually, it's not about counting. It's actually about the content, the intent of the transaction. And so, you know, when we look at what's being regulated in terms of prohibited content, I mean, there are the things that we can all, you know, agree and nod on, which is, you know, adult pornographic and, you know, gambling based on destination region. You know, we are starting to see some other interesting areas come in. So things like contests, you know, what point is a contest gambling or not gambling? And, you know, becomes quite arbitrary in the assessment of that. You know, the trouble with regulation is at some point, someone has to be an arbiter of a decision. So what makes something a contest? You know, if a church fete wants to have a competition to support the church roof, you know, is that a contest? Somebody's got to make a call on that. Telecom services we're starting to see, you know, is that as a result of lobbying by operators to say people shouldn't promote competitive services? Religious content, again, you know, religious content is a very broad, very subjective spectrum when you start to look at the edges of that. So, you know, is that notifying of church opening times, notifying of church fates? You know, is that considered prohibited content? You know, motivational content. You know, at what point is motivation religious? You know, this is where I think well-intentioned regulation starts to hit a wall of practicality. Who is actually an arbiter of what is religious content? Understandably, political content is an area that I think many regulators are still trying to get to grips with. You know, we have seen in now many regions, particularly during times of national elections, there's a complete moratorium on any mention of any political party to avoid undue influence. But at what point is political content totally prohibited, and political causes? You know, what is considered political versus maybe a local grassroots cause activity? So again, sometimes the ambiguity of regulation can create far greater problems than the original intent of the regulation itself. And what we now start to see is it's not just this classification of content, but there are rules on when content can be sent. And again, understandably, you know, who wants to be disturbed in the middle of the night by a promotional message or a coupon offering you a discount? You know, we can see there's such a disparity here on times. You know, certainly sending organizations need to become experts in world time zones and daylight savings time changes and different time zones in different countries and regions there. But more importantly, the devil in the detail on this is it requires all of the sending parties to also now become aware of the type of message being sent. Because at the end of the day, the liability will rest with the last party who was carrying that message. So aggregators will be hit, who will back off charges to CPaaS and originating on board companies. So how will folks ensure that the message that they're carried for delivery to France at 10:30 p.m. is an important 2FA code that somebody needs to access an account versus a promotional or marketing message? So this is where, James, we're starting to see the industry needs to get more advanced approaches. It's not just about counting.
And this comes to your solutions. Your solutions have got to take into account all of these and be aware of all the regulations. Because you look at Brazil and same in India, marketing and transactional content has got to be separated and connections to the operators in which it goes. So you've got that separation between marketing and transactional content. You've got to know the times. You've got to know what content can and can't be sent. If there are any specific keywords as well, specific text words that cannot be used, it's an absolute minefield. So this area is truly, truly something that you've got to be an expert on if you're stepping into it. So companies such as yourselves and others who are in the room and who will be speaking later today, you've built up expertise over many years, and that cannot be replicated overnight. And I think there's this misconception that anyone can just roll into the game of SMS delivery, and technically you can within 24 hours. Simeon, you and I could be in business. We could have our own cloud solution from a number of well-known providers out there, and we could connect up to one of the well-known aggregators, and hello, tomorrow evening we're in business. We could technically be allowed to send around the world. But are we following the regulations? Will we be successful over the long term? And it's clear that the major business messaging companies out there have been around for many, many years. And it's the knowledge of these regulations which has helped cement their position.
Yeah. I think there is also very much because this is such a broad spectrum, there are areas that as an industry we can do really well. You know, if people want to have controls over unwanted contact out of hours, that's pretty straightforward to be able to do. What does become harder is when the regulation says, well, okay, stop the spread of information that is deliberately misleading. You know, we're seeing this, and this is where the mobile industry suffers the same challenges as the social media industry. You know, who actually becomes an expert on whether a particular piece of advice about COVID is legitimate? You know, that now starts to become incredibly domain specific. If there's information about voting or polling, who is the expert to determine whether that is accurate? If somebody is saying this voting center has closed, is that legitimate and is that informational? Or is that actually a deliberate misinformation campaign to try and mislead voters? And I think as an industry, again, we need to start to establish some clear boundaries of what we can provide and areas where we will have no expertise. And really, we need to try and find a way of resolving those problems, maybe with broader industries. So the best practices, you know, codified in the MEF documents and in various other documents, like we've seen things like the US CTIA organization do this. You know, we're seeing countries like Singapore and France and a range of others code up best practices. Fortunately, there seems to be consistency, at least in terms of these sort of broad categories, and also great to see that there's a lot more focus on things like consent and control, enabling end users to opt out. You know, we're starting to see very prescriptive, and I spoke earlier about hard and tight regulation, but in some areas, at least definitions of the type of prohibited bad activity is good. So, you know, we've got, the previous slide was very much more around, you know, what is a good experience, this is now what should be considered bad experience, no matter what the media, no matter what the engagement, no matter what the traffic path of the party. These are things that people should not be subjected to, harassment, social engineering, phishing, credential theft. Those are bad activities. But we spent a lot of time talking about regulation. There is the other side to regulation, which is supervision. Regulation in its purest sense is a document. It's the rules of the road. These are the laws that should be followed. Supervision is really about ensuring compliance to those rules. Who actually is monitoring and then actually being able to take enforcement actions? And first observation is really predominantly, I think, regulators, their main data feed is consumer complaint. That in itself can be very arbitrary. If 5 consumers complain about something, is that 5 complaints against a campaign of 500 messages that have been sent, or 5 million? Context is really quite important there, and understanding, was it because they withdrew consent, they weren't aware they'd given consent, that it was misleading, that consent had been transferred, that it was inappropriate, that it was offensive, that they found it offensive, but the other 4,990,995 people found it acceptable? So I think, again, coming back to data, it's about looking at how we can better support regulators when they're now looking at this aspect of supervision. Because now they've got the rules, a lot of them want to show that that rule work was valuable, that they are cleaning and improving, and that they're finding cases and they're making the industry a better place. So, on that topic, I think it's great to look at Stir Shaken. That's something that's really had quite seismic effects on the North American voice marketplace. We're 9 months into Stir Shaken now. In fact, actually almost approaching a year, I think. And I think that the common view is that there's been probably close to about $500 million spent on solutions and working on this and implementation and operation.
Simeon, for the audience, could you just explain basically what Stir Shaken is? We've got a session coming up very soon, which that topic will be introduced, but just to lay the road for that, what is Stir Shaken in simple language?
Okay, I shall try a very, very non-technical one. Which
that's fine by me, yes, that's me.
Welcome to enhance, but in essence, Stir is all about certification and identification of a caller. The cause and the catalyst of all of this was the massive robocall problem that the US faced. I think there's several camps of view as to why the US has been so bad. I think ourselves and others would argue it's because we've driven attackers away and cleaned up a lot of the messaging side, forced it onto voice. But in essence, if you're a mobile user in the US, you will have received and be inundated with unwanted calls. So Stir Shaken really is an initiative to say who is making that call, and then are they authorized? Do we know actually who that party is? Do we have a mechanism to control that end user? So the identity that they're using, is that actually their business, and are they allowed to engage?
Perfect, thank you.
So all of this was put in place to address the robocall problem. And I think the latest stats is on average about 5 billion robocalls every month. That's just a staggeringly large number. And as a result of Stir Shaken, there has been a reduction in robocalls. So this has meant that carriers have been able to say, this inbound call, is it one of 3 levels of attestation? I know exactly who is making the call, or I know who the network is that's delivering the call, or I know the network that has aggregated the networks behind it to make that call. So all in all, resulted in 12% reduction in robocalls. Unfortunately, spammers have adopted Stir Shaken. They've adopted authentication. Um, when we actually look at it, I mean, this goes true of every single security mechanism you can think of, whether it be something highly technical like stir shaken, or whether it be something as simple as having photo ID for door-to-door salesmen. Things that can be easily copied and cloned. Bad actors don't stop what they're doing just because there is some technology or some simple check. What they do is actually embrace and adopt that and say, well, actually, if I adopt that, it gives me legitimacy. It gives my victim a view that actually I am now authenticated. I am who I pretend to be. And in fact, with stir shaken, the latest stats are that with the grade B and C attestation, the calls are 5 times more likely to be robocalls. So, they have absolutely embraced stir shaken and used it to their own ends. If we look at the signed robocall volumes, I mean, the latest numbers are now putting this way up at about 40, in fact, actually above 40% for Class B and Class C stir shaken calls. So as a mechanism, it hasn't had the effect or the promise that the regulation and the industry was hoping.
Simeon, can I just ask you about self-regulation? How effective has self-regulation been so far, and what role does it have to play?
Well, I think so often self-regulation is a preemptive form of trying to do something in advance of being further regulated. So it's, I think, rarely fully altruistic in nature. It is always an attempt to avoid something worse. How effective? I would actually argue that self-regulation has the same fundamental limitation that regulation has, which is the intent of it was to avoid something. The intent was not actually to necessarily address the root cause of that problem. And I think this is where things like stir shaken, and in fact I'm sure it will come up in discussion on the next session, but the desire for the US to roll this out to the rest of the world, is the industry, are the US regulators, and we know what the answer is, truly looking at statistics with an independent, impartial mindset to say, is this being effective? Or actually, should I look at the regulation and maybe take a step back and say, is this having the effect that I wanted? Which in the instance of stir shaken was to reduce robocalls. And this chart, I mean, so the red line is a trend line. I'm not sure how big this is appearing on the screen there, but I'd challenge anyone to see.
It's coming out fine, it's big, yeah.
Yeah, that looks like a pretty horizontal line to me as a trend. That's not a decrease. That is not the line as something that is successful and effective in reducing a problem. This is an independent organization, UMail, who publish a robocall index. This shows the counts ever since stir shaken was implemented in June. Appreciate, it's damn lies and statistics. Every single piece of statistic is presented from the perspective of, the presenter. I mean, in the interest of disclaimer, we have no solution on stir shaken. We've got no dog in this fight, so we're not trying to fully make a point. Although what I am highlighting is, look at the details. Is it actually having a beneficial effect to US consumers in addressing robocalls?
Simeon, we're a couple of minutes away from the close. Can I just for your closing remarks on the topic before we move into this exact topic, perfect segue into that topic. So just to summarize your take, and indeed an AdaptiveMobile's take on regulation, and what you think, how regulators should behave ultimately from what you've seen.
Yeah, well, I've got 2 points on that. Then first off, we've talked about regulation and supervision being the enforcement of it. So, I mean, this I want to have as a data point, as a lesson on what I consider to be poor supervision. So in the case of robocalls, there was action by the FCC and FTC and DOJ in the US. I mean, every three-letter industry organization and governmental organization you can think of, they levied a fine of just under $3.3 million against a gentleman who was sending out tens of millions of robocalls on a clear COVID-19 scam. Yeah, he admitted it. He admitted he made the calls. He actually ran a marketing business and a VoIP provider to make those calls. So he was in essence acting as a service provider as well as the marketing provider. The summary take-home point is that penalty was suspended. He wasn't even banned from running a telco service. There is an excellent article that Eric Priest-Comms Comms Risk has written on this. I would really strongly urge everyone to have a read of this. Regulation, if it doesn't follow through with supervision, and if that doesn't follow through on collection, is pointless. Yeah, it's an empty stick of a carrot versus stick. And the other closing point I'd make is that so often regulation is focused on the stick. You know, there is so little focus on, well, actually, what about everyone that does conform, everyone that does comply? There is so many opportunities. Again, we've got empirical data, we've got measurement points, we've got an industry that is obsessed with statistics and data collection and quality because we know the value it adds to our businesses. Why not start expressly saying in regulation, these are the benefits of compliancy? And let's also say, look, we've got mechanisms to do enforcement. We can limit bad sending. We can reward good sending. Let's focus on the upside as well as the downside. Let's get data-driven changes to this whole environment that's to our benefit.
Perfect. Any questions in the room? I know we're a couple of minutes over, but if anyone's got any pressing questions here in the room, then please. No? Oh, it's one question? No, no questions. No questions in the room? All set. Okay, Simeon, thank you very much for your time. A fantastic topic. And it's clear there's so much to be done on this topic. But from the talks yesterday and from your presentation today, the light touch regulation seems to be the way to go where possible. But ideally, hopefully, it shouldn't actually be required. That's it. Thank you very much for AdaptiveMobile's support, and great seeing you, and thank you for your time. And audience, please thank Simeon. Thank you.
Thank you.